Welcome to the Overton Pod. Kanthan, welcome back.
Thank you. It's been a rough several weeks, but here we are.
Yeah, why is that?
Well, because you've been ill and on the brink of death.
I was man down.
But you lived to tell the tale.
Just barely. Just barely. I can tell you. I don't know what's going around. I wasn't sure if it was food poisoning or some sort of bug. I mean, of course, it was COVID because everything's COVID now. But here I am once again.
You sure it wasn't Putin's fault?
I mean, it could be Putin. And of course, at the end of the day, Kanthan, the Jews. We must blame the Jews.
But, given that that's the default scenario, are we going to be talking about the fact that the sky is blue? We all know to blame your tribe.
Yes, we must always blame the Jews for everything. They control everything, except when they don't, even though they still do, So, Klaus Schwab, for example, not Jewish, but he must be controlled by Jews, you see.
Are you sure he's not Jewish?
Yeah, yes, I'm quite positive. You need to go look at, have you heard about his father's background?
I have not heard about it. Was his father a Nazi?
His father, well, there's debate about whether he was an actual Nazi, but he provided a lot of support to the Nazis.
We probably should restart this because YouTube does filtering, and every time someone mentions the
Jews or the Nazis.
Yes, they immediately downvote it.
Yeah, that's all right. It's fine.
So it's okay to speak about the man with the mustache.
Yeah, I assume you're not allowed to use the A word then, like his name.
I don't know.
It's interesting.
I guess we're going to find out.
Should we just trash our entire metrics?
Yes, and start again. Yes.
Absolutely. Talking about bad ideas, there's a certain South African publication that decided it would be a good idea to go offline for a day because that would be a way to convince people that they needed the product. Now, I need to say up front that nowhere in history has anyone ever been able to convince people that they really need a product by disappearing from the market when those people don't originally buy that product in the first place. It's not a very convincing argument.
This is kind of like people like me who are off-grid and Eskom gives us a hard time, yes.
Yes, or we're going to increase your tariffs. Okay, fair enough, please do that, or whatever. Who cares? It's a bit strange, but of course we're referring to the Daily Maverick. I suppose we have to mention them by name. So here's some free advertising for you, Branko. A weird decision. I think backfired spectacularly against them in deciding to suspend their website and I guess what they would call their news coverage and commentary for a 24-hour period. And instead asking people to donate. But I think the important bit here is instead of saying, look, it's tough times, the economy's not great, all of these things are accurate and true. Of course, they would never for one stop for a moment to think about why that might be and what role they had to play in it. But instead of just saying, look, those are the sort of circumstances we operate in and it's a difficult market, and please, if you can, would you donate something to us or would you subscribe? Instead, they went, we are saving democracy. You find that odd at all?
Well, since democracy has been saved by them, and thank you very much, you guys can now retire and the rest of us will move on. Fundamentally, the issue that they have is that the business model is fundamentally flawed because people will end up paying for a very specific product. And, as a case in point, I was drawn to Daily Maverick in the beginning because there were very specific people who are writing for them who actually no longer write for them. Mm-hmm. Now, at that point, if you had turned around and said, would I be willing to pay a subscription in order to be getting access to this content? The answer would probably have been yes, because I used to subscribe to Maverick magazine, which was the predecessor of the Daily Maverick. You might remember their slogan was for people with brains and money.
That's right.
And they consistently wrote towards that particular theme. And I must tell you, it was a freaking good magazine.
Yeah, it was like, if I can describe it, because I also read it at the time and paid for it, it was a GQ for people with brains. I thought that was very much the mold.
I think, yeah, that's a good way to describe the way it was going at the time.
Yeah, it was. The magazine was very nice, glossy, very well done. The stuff that was in there was thought provoking. It wasn't stuff you would find anywhere. It certainly wasn't kind of mainstream thinking necessarily. It wasn't this sort of left-wing political agenda in any way. It wasn't particularly right-wing either. It was quite commonsensical, very much market-related, and a good publication. And in fact, when the Daily Maverick sort of kicked off, there was a lot of, I remember, because I was one of them, I was quite excited about it. There was a lot
as was I. In fact, at the time, I was running YFM. And I gave them a massive amount of free publicity. So I dedicated a 5-minute slot on the breakfast show for them to give a daily punt in terms of what they were going to be covering on Daily Maverick. Sipo Hlongwane, you might remember him, Comrade Sipo, used to come into studio, and he used to do that 5-minute slot on the breakfast show every day. And I was, hugely enthusiastic about the product and was really hoping that this was going to make a seminal impact upon the South African media landscape.
Absolutely.
And then there was this progressive virtue signaling that just kind of kept beating us over the head. And I couldn't for the life of me figure out, why on earth are you going down this road? Just focus on doing good journalism. Stop preaching, because... Yeah, none of us like to be preached to. We do want information that's going to be useful.
I suppose she would probably appreciate the criticism in a way, but for me, Rebecca Davis was the start of that. It was, and there were others, obviously, but she was a very loud voice in the Daily Maverick. What must be a decade ago now, and certainly very left-wing and very much pushing those types of politics. And along with her and around that time, and remember she became, I think, a deputy editor at one point, and may still well be. I actually have no idea what her status is, but there were just a lot of people brought in who made it a very sort of politically driven machine, and obviously of their politics. And it's weird to me that there's so much in an echo chamber that they cannot engage with the idea that where they find themselves today in strife, frankly, is directly as a result of their own decisions.
You see, I have a very different take on this, because frankly, I don't give a stuff about the politics of particular journalists.
Yes.
And my view is that everyone is entitled to have exactly the type of politics that they actually get excited about. Just don't bring it into your journalism. Because from my perspective, journalism has to be about who, what, where, when, why, and how. And if you're offering an opinion, give me facts and then express that opinion as an interpretation of the facts that you put on the table. But when you start off with the opinion and then you go down that rabbit hole, it leads to the type of disaster that we've got right now in most of the media. I don't want to single out the Daily Maverick for this.
So this is spoken like a businessman in media. I mean, you've been in business of media your whole life.
That's right. So for that brief period when I went back to ENCA and I was set the task of getting them back above 50%, and I was given a year to do it, and I did it in 3 months. And it was by the very simple route of telling the presenters and the journalists, I don't want your personal opinions, because the viewers don't want your personal opinions.
Yes.
I want you to give me a who, what, where, when, why, and how. I don't want you to use adjectives, and I want you to actually tell your story in pictures, and I want those stories to be no longer than 1.5 minutes each.
Yeah.
And guess what? 3 months later, the ENCA was sitting back comfortably over,
because people can
over
pick
50%.
up on that level of quality.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me also that I'm still shocked that in the dishonesty, I would suppose, in media. So if, for example, the Daily Maverick, News 24, any of our platforms, if you were to say to them, look, guys, just be honest about your bias. Just be honest about where you stand in the world.
No, but I'm not interested in your bias. You see, my point is everyone's got biases.
Yes.
I go out of my way to not let my biases get into my writing. And at the point at which I see that I'm venturing down that path, I actually try to call myself out on it. But it's actually very possible to do this because you have to wear two different hats. When you are writing as a journalist, you're meant to be fact-based. When you're delivering an opinion piece, then by all means, say, I happen to think that Netanyahu...
I'm a bit more cynical than you in that I think that you can try to do what you're saying, and maybe you can do it individually. But I don't think you can do it in larger organizations.
No,
I
actually,
think,
you can. And
but who's achieved that? So let's use foreign examples.
I've done it twice in terms of e-media, just to put that in perspective. When I was managing editor of the Cape Times, we pushed the circulation at that point. At one stage, we were selling over 60,000 copies a day, which was the highest there has ever been. More to the point, when I became managing editor of the Cape Times, we reached profitability for the first time in 15 years. And I was there for a 2-year period. This stuff is actually incredibly simple. Because people want to make up their own minds. They just want enough information to be able to make up their minds properly.
I'm just wondering... I'm hearing you and I'm listening to you because you have this knowledge and the wisdom and the experience in this field. So it's not an argument at all. I'm just looking at the way all media has seemed to have progressed globally. If I use foreign examples, Sky News in Australia, for example, is very much right-wing or right of centre, put it that way. Sky News in the UK is very much left of centre. I can tell you that Sky News in the UK would like Labour to be the next government, not the Tories, for example. I can also tell you that Fox in the United States is on the right, and I can also tell you that CNN, MSNBC, etc. are on the left. Fox does something quite interesting, which is that they split their news platform into two components. They split it into comment and into news. And this is according to people who've worked there, like Megyn Kelly, they specifically direct the people in news to do what you're talking about, which is to talk about the facts and to not imbue their own views into the facts. But their commentary people... They make a clear delineation between this, are allowed to obviously have their biases and agendas and put them out onto air, which is how you end up with, Tucker Carlson or Hannity or any of those types. I'm just wondering if what you're saying is wonderful. I wish we had more of it. And I cannot come up with an example in South Africa currently where we have media who are openly fact-based, and are impartial, as close as you can get to being impartial. It just seems to me, I take the election as the current situation, so to speak, and I look at where everyone stands in the media, and News 24 is constantly running bits about, obviously they're terrified of Jacob Zuma, so they constantly run what they think are negative bits about Jacob Zuma, but actually make him look cool. But that's because Adrian Basson was obviously bullied as a child and has never joined the cool kids. And they constantly write hit pieces on the DA, also like rubbish, but they're always race-based hit pieces on the DA. It's John Steenhuisen said something arbitrary that actually nobody would care about unless we kind of spun this little web and made him sound worse than he does. And of course, we can pick up a few idiots on social media who will run with this. And so it's clear where News 24 stands in the election, even though the ANC has destroyed this country. It very much seems to me that they want the ANC to win this next election. The only other people they will support, inverted commas, in opposition are other socialists, like now Razem Zansi, for example, or occasionally a complimentary thing about something the EFF is doing or whatever it happens to be. that's one example. And I can go through all of our media and come up with clear examples of bias, clear examples of non-impartiality. They clearly are partial to certain parties, literally. And I just cannot find that in our landscape. And I think that's why our journalism is dying. But journalism globally is dying. This is a known problem.
No, actually, if you take a look at very specific markets, so India, for example, has a thriving media landscape.
Okay.
South Korea has a thriving
But
media landscape.
India's a dictatorship, under Modi. I mean, that's what we would be told.
Let's not go down that.
All right, but tell me more about that.
India has, close to 1 billion people that are going to vote in elections. And the elections get held with voter ID and where everyone is checked to ensure that everything is legal, and all of the counting gets done by hand, and all of the parties are present to ensure that there is no tomfoolery that goes on. So, look, I mean, India is the world's largest democracy, but of course, India has also got a culture of literacy, so
yes.
which also helps. But to my point, India is a very good example. Hong Kong is an excellent example.
At the moment?
Yes, very much so. The newspapers in Hong Kong do very well. So, in as much as, yes, we are fully aware of the fact that Beijing is constantly turning the screws in terms of
interfering.
Anything. Well, they're exercising their rights in terms of the way in which the Hong Kong handover deal was structured. And the truth of the matter is that if I consider what's happened since 1997, which is when the Hong Kong handover took place, if not for the fact that there had been this constant injection of funds on the part of the U.S. to try and foment insurrection out there, I think that Xi would have been very happy to sit back and let things actually proceed. But this constant attempt on the part of the U.S. to foster these color revolutions. So if you look in terms of what's currently happening in Georgia, we've been following what's been going on out there, because essentially what's happening is
the latest.
Yes, the latest. So
you'll have to inform me.
Okay, so over the past couple of days, there's been, thousands of people taking to the streets and all waving European flags. Now, I'm pretty sure that if you and I suddenly wanted to go out and protest in support of either Israel or Palestine, we've got ready access to flags, don't we, John?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean...
Yeah, clearly. No, I've got a whole cupboard of them.
Yeah, so when you've got thousands of these flags being handed out to demonstrators, and there's clearly money behind them. The issue that the Georgians are basically trying to pass into law is to say that we want to curtail the ability of foreign NGOs to actually interfere in terms of funding public discourse, which is, I must tell you, is a relatively tame version of laws that already exist in most of the Western world.
Yeah,
but clearly you want the ability to be able to influence that discourse and to foment insurrection. So it's not only
let's talk about this more, because I think for me this is quite interesting. Moving it on from the Daily Maverick and their failed.
But it is
PR.
germane to the Daily
Absolutely.
Maverick, because the likes of the Open Society Foundation,
yes,
are responsible for funding a lot of these media outlets.
That's correct.
You've got Daily Maverick, you've got Amabungane, you've got Roundup, and
just so we're equal in our criticism, not just OSF but Omidyar as well. Most people don't even know about Pierre Omidyar, a really unsavory character.
I've got to start with OSF because Soros is a Jew, and
of course, and the Jews control everything
except
when it's Pierre Omidyar, and then of course it's not, but it is somehow still. But what I'm getting at is, they're saying they're saving democracy, and I think what I've found so interesting about the discourse in the last 5 years or so is that everything you're being told it's almost opposite world that we live in. So Donald Trump is a threat to democracy and is going to behave like a dictator. Then Joe Biden behaves like a dictator and is clearly a threat to democracy. We get told that immigration, for example, makes everything better, right? Interesting conversation I had with someone I follow on X the other day. Whereby they said, well, there's a study that shows this from the UN. It wasn't in regard to immigration. It was actually in regard to minimum wage. And, of course, there's a study from the UN showing minimum wage is a great idea. And I said, yeah, but you see, the problem with that is that I can tell you that study was designed to show you that minimum wage is a great idea because it's funded by the UN, who believes deeply in minimum wage. And so what I'm getting at is that a lot of the stuff we're told is, and that we're doing globally as a political policy, is the opposite of what it should be. So everything we're told, the media say they're saving democracy, but to me it looks like they're doing the opposite, which is that they're more and more backing certain parties, not supporting kind of an open election. They're pushing that bias onto people in a landscape where they demand censorship by people who are fact checkers, who are either people who work in those media organizations or used to work in those media organizations. And so we have this situation of this complete opposites. We're saving democracy. No, you're actually not saving democracy. This guy's going to be a dictator. No, actually, you're a dictator. We want a free and fair vote, but also no voter ID. We believe in free speech, but not your speech, not those words, not those things. The planet is burning. Oh, we just had the coldest month ever here. Everything is upside down and back to front. And for me, this is the reason why journalism is dying. It's because there's an incongruence between what you're talking about, where you go into a newsroom and you say, we're going to report the facts, and what's actually occurring in most newsrooms globally, which is certainly in the West, which is that they're not reporting the facts. They're reporting what they want you to believe.
But again, that comes down to the fact that we don't have a free and independent media, because all of our mainstream media, and look, let's be very clear, I count Daily Maverick as part of the mainstream media.
Oh, sure.
They all essentially have paymasters that are not dictated by commercial interests.
Right. And so this is where the interesting part is, because where does all that stuff come from? It's so fascinating. So South Africa, as an example, I look at South Africa and I called out Chris Yelland the other day, because Chris Yelland is very much, he's an energy expert. I won't take that away from him. He knows far more about the electrical grid, etc., than I do. However, since Eskom started faltering, he has very much stuck the knife in at every opportunity. He's got no solutions for how Eskom could improve in terms of as a coal-based generating facility. He has very wonderful ideas about how renewables are going to save us from everything. And very importantly, he hates nuclear. He despises nuclear. So what you have is someone who's pushing renewables, which are non-renewable, green energy, which is not reliable, and also not cheap. And in a country, now South Africa, this is very important for us, is you may be able to make these arguments in some places. So is it Denmark or Norway that uses a lot of hydroelectric energy, and so they're able to have renewable energy running their grid a lot of the time, because the majority of that is not solar or wind, it's actually hydroelectric. But you'd have to have a country where you've got a lot of mountainous regions and you've got dams in the right places, etc., etc.
Well, to that point, do you know that one of the places in the world right now where there's a massive amount of Bitcoin mining taking place is in the DRC?
And the reason for that?
And the reason for that is that they have access to free electricity from the Congo Dam project, which, remember, that Eskom is part owner of. And the idea was that there was going to be cables that were running from there down to South Africa. It's a 3,000-kilometer stretch that was meant to be providing us with electricity. The problem is that they were not able to get that off the ground because it has to pass through a number of other territories, and all of those countries, in exchange for the privilege of running cables between the DRC and South Africa, want a little bit of the electricity. Mm-hmm. And the cost in terms of actually delivering that electricity becomes quite prohibitive, simply in terms of the length of cable that's required. So someone quite close to me came up with a very clever plan, which was to run DC from there down to
Oh, wow.
to
That's
South
smart.
Africa. Well, because it effectively halves the
Yes.
number of cables that you use. The issue, of course, is that if you're running DC across that length, you can't draw down little bits of power in between.
No.
Yeah. So
Because you have to then convert it at every point, which probably becomes quite prohibitive as well.
exactly. Yeah. So, but we digress a bit. But,
Yes.
we're talking about the fact
Well, I'm
that,
talking
yeah,
about the influence. And so South Africa has, and I'm using the energy example, South Africa has an abundance of coal. We have quite a lot of gas. And certainly if we frack, we have one of the largest reserves in the world. And we've discovered a lot of oil off of our west and southern coasts. And so if we decided to become an oil producer and a gas producer, we could essentially be very much energy positive and energy rich very quickly. Okay, I've said this many times. Gas turbines take about 18 months to build. We could build 5 or 6 gas turbines and load shedding would be a thing of the past. That would take 18 months and a couple of fracking wells and you're done. Over and above that, LNG, LPG is a very good commodity to be selling, is used worldwide, is shipped worldwide, and it wouldn't be a bad idea for us to be exporting that. We could really uplift our economy through oil and gas. And regardless, we're a country with a lot of these things. Even if we don't go the oil and gas route, we have a ton of coal, and that's an understatement by many tons. But at the same time, the people who are pushing all of our energy stuff, the likes of Chris Yelland and co., are saying, no, we must all go to solar panels and renewables, wind farms and things, all right? And the question is, why do they say that? Why does our media say that? Why does the Daily Maverick, for example, have a climate change section within the paper? Why is that? And the reason for that is what you're talking about, which is that we're getting funding, not from our government, and not from people in this country, but we're getting funding from foreign governments and foreign NGOs, which are pushing their ideas, their ideals, and their wants into our country.
Now, to my point,
Yes.
in terms of what went down in Hong Kong, it's precisely the fact that Beijing turned around and said, we're not going to allow you guys to come in here and spend your money and influence the political discourse that's happening in Hong Kong. And, let's be very clear. They have actually been maintaining the one country, two system setup because, certainly from a commerce point of view, everything flows quite happily through Hong Kong. Yeah. They have their own currency, which is not backed in any way by Beijing, which is freely tradable, and the economy is doing very well. Thank you very much. Even though it's a tiny collection of land, most of it on islands that have no resources to speak of, and yet they're able to dominate the world in just so many sectors. So in shipping, in terms of fintech, I could go on with lots of stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm very much in favor of ensuring that all of these foreign funders are actually shut off.
And this is what Georgia's doing.
Yes, this is what Georgia is trying to do, and of course, but to that point as well. Remember the chaos that's been happening in Israel over the past year or so was basically because of the fact that there's all of this money that's being poured into Israel in order to incite insurrection to prevent Parliament from reasserting control of the lawmaking of the lawmaking process. Yeah. It's exactly the same scenario, and you will find exactly the same paymasters behind the protests that are happening in Israel, the protests that are happening in Georgia, and pretty much around the world. So these NGOs, we actually need to find enough of a groundswell of opinion in this country for them to actually be shut down. The problem, of course, is that, and it goes back to the thing that I've spoken about in the past, where 80% of the people are not affected by these things, and unless you can persuade them that it's in their interest to do so, well, let's see how things go after this election.
I think there's another component to it, which is that these organizations are not dumb. They're very smart people involved in them. I don't underestimate them in any way. I dislike them, but I don't underestimate them. And we need to remember that a lot of this is very well coordinated and very well planned. So, for example, if we have something that comes up in South Africa, a social issue, and this is where they'll often get involved. And suddenly you'll have a whole bunch of people pushing a certain narrative, and the media will push the same, and everyone seems to be on the same page all of a sudden. It's inconceivable that everyone agrees that's on something we weren't talking about a few months ago, but suddenly we're all in agreement that this is a net positive for the country. But what you often find is that you will have the same thing occur amongst politicians and political parties, and that's because there's funding going that way as well. And so, that's also of concern, and not only funding, but there's a revolving door. So you go do a bit of Googling research and find out who sits at pick any NGO that interferes in the political affairs of any country. There's plenty of them. I'll give you an example, recent example. So Gun Free South Africa had a PR campaign that they ran about a week or 10 days ago. Credit to them, their most successful PR campaign. Everything they've done up till now has been pretty much a lie, debunked, but unfortunately they've got the loudhailer. This PR campaign was, we're going to erect a playground, I think in Mitchell's Plain or something to that effect.
And put up a fence around it.
And it's going to be bulletproof glass all
Yes.
around. It's going to be this giant kids playground and then bulletproof glass, 4 meters up all the way around. And okay, so they put that out, and then people reacted because they go, oh my goodness, they're gonna, but they do it as if it's a real thing. They're going to build this playground with this bulletproof glass, and of course that's to create the discussion, which is why it was a successful campaign. It's to create the discussion, and then a week later they'll turn around and go, well, what if we just didn't have guns, and then we wouldn't need to protect children with bulletproof glass. We could just let them be children, you see. And it's a very clever campaign, and it's very well done. But the question you have to ask yourself is, we live in South Africa. Okay, and again, it's a South African issue. It applies to many countries, but in this instance, it's very much applicable here, which is that we have a rate of crime and violence which is intolerable. The amount of
well, it's clearly tolerable because we live here.
That's true. But it's not one we should tolerate, put it that way. And we constantly go on about, there's all if you were to ask what's the media and high society, so to speak, default position on guns, that default position is guns are bad, and if we could, we should ban guns. Okay, that's kind of where the position sits. Now, if you go to the average member of the population who isn't the editor of a newspaper and who doesn't necessarily have the reins of one of the NGOs, they will say to you, probably, I own a gun. That they may very well say. Certainly a lot of men in this country own guns across races. It's not a racial thing at all. Lots of men own guns. And in fact, women are a very fast growing sector of gun owners, and probably the largest growing sector of gun owners, because logical people have realized that in a country with this much violence, number one, the police have admitted they're not coming to save you. And number two is, you have to be able to equalize force in a violent scenario.
You reminded me of something very interesting because, it went back to my asking, what is the single thing that the U.S. could have done in the 20 years that they were in Afghanistan that would have made a huge difference? And the answer to me very simply is that you would have trained every single woman in that country to carry. Simple.
Yeah, and then when the men came back to oppress them, it would have been quite difficult.
To my point here, once again, we, in terms of the way in which these discussions shift, take the view that there's always a point at which something gets injected into the political discourse with the view to actually influencing the debate going forward. And nearly always it's based on something that is completely untrue. So now, you must ask yourself, where did the phrase white monopoly capital first originate? And how did it gain currency?
Bell Pottinger, of course.
In terms,
Kanthan.
yes, exactly. So, but that was very carefully injected into the discourse.
Yes.
So, state capture, again, was very much in exactly the same way.
Yes.
It starts off, but it actually gets injected and it gets amplified.
Yes.
And if you actually start tracking back to the source of where all of those come, and try and find the way in which these memes get generated.
Yes.
That's pretty much what they are. That then helps us to actually understand. But to a large extent, it all comes about because someone injects it into the mainstream.
Correct.
Because suddenly there was a point at which everyone started putting up pronouns on their bios.
Yes. So quickly back to Gun Free South Africa, that PR campaign. Gun Free South Africa are not a particularly impressive organization, but they have funding. So they're not doing anything unless they have the funding to do it, right? You don't get articles in media like that unless you have money to put out the press releases. Some of those articles may even be paid for. But the point is that they have money. It's the same with the Bell Pottinger example.
Are you suggesting that our media take money to actually...
I know for a fact they do. I know for a fact they do. There's a whole bunch of articles that you read that you don't even know are advertorials without being advertorials.
I'm sorry, I didn't have a sarcasm flag in front of my face.
No, I realize.
Right.
I realize. But for the viewing and listening audience, I think that's important that they understand that there's plenty of stuff that gets paid for. And this is the point you're making. To the point, Bell Pottinger comes up with white monopoly capital, but Bell Pottinger's a business at the time. Okay, and they don't just come up with things for fun.
So who came up with Phoenix Massacre as an example? Because we know there was no Phoenix Massacre. Mm-hmm. And yet that now kind of
it endures.
Prevails. Yeah, it endures in the mainstream. To a large extent, Marikana Massacre is exactly the same thing.
You to say that.
Yeah, because... once again, you might remember that you and I had a discussion about this probably, 5-6 years ago now, where I said there was no Marikana Massacre. What there was a sustained campaign of violence that was fought between two warring union factions in that part of the world.
Yep.
And
which led to several deaths.
Which saw police officers hacked to death with pangas.
And security guards.
Yes. But more to the point, when you have police officers whose brethren have been hacked to death by the very same people who are now facing them as a crowd, are you expecting them to show restraint? I don't think so. Because I certainly would not in that particular position.
Yes.
But again, the Marikana Massacre is something that continues.
There's only one side of that story which is acceptable now. Right, the narrative which is acceptable.
But it's not a question of whether it's acceptable. It's a question of what gets constantly amplified. Because the thing is that if you have enough of a body of people who have access to the information of what actually went down on the ground, people would make up their own minds, which goes back to our starting point to say you give people facts and let them make up their minds in terms of who's the bad guy and who's the good guy. But don't try and tell me who the bad guy is and who the good guy is, because there are no good guys and bad guys in the world. There are good actions and bad actions. Some people have a preponderance of bad actions, but I want to be able to make up my mind in terms of that, and I will eventually get to the stage where I will say without hesitation, I want Hamas wiped off the face of the earth. Does that mean that I think that Netanyahu is a good guy? No. But it's possible to actually hold those ideas simultaneously based on the facts that have been made available to me. I think, for example, that Netanyahu was a complete tosser for attacking a diplomatic mission in a foreign country. Don't do stuff like that. That's a flagrant violation of international law. It doesn't matter how much people might support you around the world. You can't walk that one back because you don't have any plausible excuse for actually justifying that. It's exactly the same way as the U.S. targeting the Chinese embassy in Belgrade when they were bombing them back in the 90s.
Yeah, we're breaking the studio, by the way.
Oh,
leave it alone. It's cool. Let it go.
Let's have a look at this. What is this we have here?
Yeah. Yeah, it's your window to the world.
I think it's meant to be a virtual background, kind of like this.
So, I mean, I hear you. We can get into that, the whole Israeli thing, and maybe we should. It's interesting because I looked into the whole embassy issue. There's a lot of debate around that. I think the debate is this, as far as I understand it. The one side will say Israel bombed the Iranian embassy in Syria. Can't do that against international law, and therefore an act of war. And therefore Israel did the first act of war with Iran. And Iran then retaliated past weekend with their 350 drones and ballistic missiles, etc. The argument, the counter to that is a few things. So number one, on the specific embassy, the embassy itself is still standing and perfectly intact. An annex building which housed the Iranian Republican Guard. Is it the Iranian Republican Guard or what, the IRGC? But it's essentially an annex building that houses the IRGC was destroyed, not the embassy. Yes, on the same premises or something to that effect. And then the other argument being, well, Iran's been at war with Israel for decades, frankly, and when you fund the 7th of October and things like that, that is in itself an act of war.
You see, the thing is that if you expect people around the world to respect your boundaries, and I'm talking very specific now in terms of Israel, now, at the point at which it's acceptable to take out the Iranian embassy, effectively what you're saying is that it's okay for anyone to try and target Israeli missions around the world. And I'm saying that that's wrong. I am saying that foreign missions, no matter how repulsive the people that they actually represent, should be considered to be sacrosanct simply because of the fact that it is in everyone's interest to actually respect those boundaries.
I hear you.
Now, to that point, let's take the view around what went down with the Mexican the embassy down in which South American country are we talking about at this point, where the vice president of the country in exile had taken refuge in the Mexican embassy, and the government breached the Mexican embassy to extricate this guy who was there on the basis of diplomatic immunity. And that's not on.
Yeah, I think there's gray here, and the gray is that if you were to, if South Africa, for example, has an embassy in America, and instead of just having diplomats in that embassy in America, they started running military operations inside that embassy with an entire barracks of troops who were armed to the teeth. And
you're allowed to do that in terms of international law. No, that's the point. It's what the host country is willing to actually accept in terms of that. Because remember that in terms of the way in which these laws work, you've got Ukraine right now, which is hosting how many CIA bases on their territory? That's perfectly acceptable in terms of international law. I am saying that if Israel is going to take the moral high ground on this, and for the longest time, prior to Netanyahu pulling this sort of BS, Israel has actually been holding a moral high ground at a number of levels. And what they've actually done at this point is they've substantially undermined their ability to defend that.
Okay, so
I'm also saying to that point that your argument right now, I'm going to say, is premised on the fact that the party involved is Israel. And if the party that was involved was not Israel, you would say, this is completely out of order. This should not be happening. Which I'm happy to take into account.
I'm not sure I would. Look, there's no other example like Iran. There's no other country which runs, which essentially has proxy states. So Syria is essentially a state of Iran at this point. Yemen is a state of Iran.
I disagree that Syria is a proxy state of Iran. There's a strong contingent in Iran that certainly Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran. Certainly the Houthis are proxies of Iran. But that doesn't matter. You are either going to take the view that you are going to fight it on the basis of the, quote, rules-based order, unquote, or you're going to actually declare anarchy. And if you're going to declare anarchy, then you are saying that terrorism is acceptable. And I'm
going to use the same logic. So I'm going to run with it. I'm going to run with it and say to you, all right, I'm going to say, if I accept your point and I say Netanyahu was completely wrong to bomb the compound, because it wasn't the embassy, but I'm going to say it was wrong to do that. He shouldn't have done that. It's against international law. And by doing that, he lost the moral high ground, so to speak. And then Iran was in their right to respond in some way.
No, I'm saying it gave Iran an excuse to respond. And it's a good excuse to respond, which is not to say that this is not a moral argument, okay? This is very simply people saying at an international level, we're going to play by the rules. So as, to this point.
You hit us, we hit you. I get it.
No, so to this point, I'm going to use the Ukraine scenario as an example. You've had Putin being very careful to not go after electric infrastructure in Ukraine. Let's be very clear that he could have taken out every single power station if he actually wanted to at any point during this conflict, but he didn't. At the point at which Ukraine then began launching attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, that's the point at which Putin said, okay, you're going after our energy infrastructure, we are going to go after yours. It was exactly the opening that was needed. And one of the biggest things that people need to understand in terms of how one manages conflict, and it goes back to what I was talking about with the Nyala males, is that the object of conflict should be to actually avoid a scenario where you are both likely to get wounded in the process. Obviously, if you're going to go in to a fight, and the object of the fight should be to win, there is no gain that was made by taking out that particular compound on what is effectively Iranian territory, because it is part of the diplomatic mission, that is actually assisting in taking Israel any closer to achieving a victory over its various enemies. It's an exercise in pinprick irritation, and the pros and cons have not actually been weighed up in terms of that. These decisions need to always be weighed against the backdrop of how many people on the global stage are going to be able to turn around and actually support me at the point at which I'm embarking on this course of action. And I want to say to the point in terms of Putin, he's played that game very, very well, because he always makes sure before he launches any particular action that he has built enough of an argument, again, in terms of international law, to be able to pursue that particular course of action. And right now, there is no justification under international law that Netanyahu can claim for going after an Iranian diplomatic mission.
By the logic, however, one pinpoint strike which irritated the Iranians didn't do much else, but, as you say, was against international law. We'll agree to disagree, but I'll take your point for my.
Do you disagree
it
was against international law?
Yes, because it wasn't an embassy. But the point being is that even if I take it was...
I'm not going to let you get away with that, because you say it wasn't at the embassy. The embassy grounds are the embassy. It's exactly what the host country determines is the premises. It's like, if you pitching up at the U.S. consulate here, just down the road from us.
Yes.
And you try to say, I'm actually just going to toss a petrol bomb over the wall.
My understanding is that it wasn't, if you take the U.S. Embassy as an example, the building next door is not the U.S. Embassy. And therefore,
no, if it's part of the grounds, that is
so
actually,
as far as I understand,
demarcated.
It isn't. But I'm willing to go look at the Google Maps and the geography. But I'm saying, for the purpose of the logic, I'm going to run with it. Netanyahu did something out of international law. Therefore, he has no support when Iran, or he has lesser support when Iran responds to that action. Iran's response was to respond to a pinpoint strike with 350 drones and several ballistic missiles aimed at population centers of Israel.
Now, I'll disagree with that because I've been analyzing those attacks very carefully, and they were all very specifically targeted at two specific bases. And it's also very clear that one of the reasons why they were able to take advantage of this, because remember, they flooded these areas with drones. And what that was able to do was to give them a very accurate map in terms of exactly where the Israeli defense networks kick in. Remember that these networks only got triggered at the point at which all of these missiles actually entered Israeli airspace. So even though they had been launched from quite a distance away, the amount of time that the Israelis had to actually respond was actually piss poor in my judgment. And what Netanyahu has done now, by giving the Iranians the excuse to do this, he's allowed them to have a very clear map.
That may be true.
No, it's not a question of whether it may be true.
It may be true, but it doesn't defeat the point I'm making.
No,
the Iranians launched
the point that I am making
a non-pinpoint strike at an entire country. You can tell me that these things were aimed at bases, but there's no way that their missiles would have only hit the bases. There's no way that they were only aiming at bases.
How many casualties have been reported from the strike?
One Palestinian child.
Uh-huh.
Well, Israeli Arab, actually.
Now, do you know why there were so few casualties?
Oh, well, I can give you a few answers to that.
Okay, the starting point is that the Israelis actually had advance notification in terms of exactly where the strikes were going to be. That notification was conveyed to the Americans via the Swiss in Tehran, who then in turn conveyed it to the Israelis, because the Iranians were very clear that they were messaging that they were going to be retaliating. So let's just be very clear about that and get that on the table to start off with. Is it clear that if Tehran actually wanted, they could have inflicted civilian casualties? Absolutely. They did not even use a fraction of the arsenal that's at their disposal.
They didn't.
And we know,
however,
the sheer volume that they have.
There's a caveat there. There is a caveat there which you're leaving out conveniently, which is that the weaponry that they used, the drones are one thing. The drones are complicated because they're not necessarily easy to take out. But if you do know where they're going and what their flight path is, etc., they become easier.
Actually, it's not a question of them easy to. You see,
but it's not the drones I want to talk about.
No, but the drones are asymmetric warfare, because what they are doing is these incredibly cheap pieces of equipment then provoke a response from very expensive ground defenses, and then allow for a mapping of exactly where those ground defenses are.
I take you on the mapping. I'm not talking about the mapping. I'm talking about an Iranian response, which whether they told the Swiss or not, and whether that was relayed to the Israelis, because they wanted to get mapped, remember? So you can't have it both ways. You can't be like, look, the Iranians didn't want to hurt anyone, but also they wanted a complete map. Well,
No,
a map.
No, I'm not saying that the Israel...
they had to notify the Israelis to get a map.
No, once again, you're being disingenuous. I didn't say that the Iranians didn't want to hurt anyone. I'm saying that the Iranians were very specific in terms of the messaging that was actually passed across.
But the reality is there was several technologies used to take down the attack. Some of them newer technologies, which haven't really been used much before. For example, a type of a space defense, essentially, against these ballistic missiles. And there was no guarantee before this attack that any of that would work, that those would necessarily stop those missiles. If you were launching those missiles from Iran, you had every reason to believe that they may hit something. And so you don't get to afterwards turn around and go, well, your bulletproof vest worked really well, so therefore you can't really hold us responsible. No, we can. We can. Because it turns out when you shoot at someone, it doesn't matter whether you hit them or not. It's still attempted murder. And so for me, the response does not line up with the original. They attacked a part of our embassy. It doesn't line up with that at all. The notion that they weren't trying to, or they weren't careless with regards to the attack in terms of that maybe they were aiming for a base, and maybe they didn't care whether they hit a whole bunch of civilians. They don't care whether they hit civilians when it's Hezbollah and Hamas. So frankly, I don't think you can tell me that the Iranians really care when it's them when their logo is painted on the missile instead of Hezbollah's logo. It's different. For me, it's not really different. So that's fine. I'm happy to say Netanyahu did something he shouldn't have done. Well, Iran just did something they shouldn't have done times 10. And for me, the entire dynamic has now changed, which I think is a very good change. And it was Bennett, I think, the former Prime Minister of Israel, who made a long commentary on this and said that he described Iran as an octopus. And he said that essentially they had been operating with tentacles throughout the region, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, other people, throughout the region to destabilize multiple governments, not just Israel that they're against. They're against the Jordanian government. They're against the Saudi Arabians. They're not friendly to a lot of people in the region. And he said that the strategy has been to fight their tentacles for many years and to not go to the head of the octopus because that's Tehran.
This is all very poetical and it's all very nice. And look, to a large extent...
So strategy is going to change. That's all I'm saying.
No, what I'm saying is that there is no strategy at present. And the reason why I say there is no strategy is because instead of actually concentrating on the places where the most immediate threats are emanating, and remember that the most immediate threat still remains in terms of what's actually going on in Gaza. The secondary threats then come from the obstructions to shipping that are taking place in the Red Sea, which is courtesy of the Houthis. And then let's also take the view that you've had Iran now responding by seizing Israeli vessels in the Straits of Hormuz, which also happened over the past week. Now, those are very specific things that are happening. Now, you then have to take the view. Let's assume that Bennett is correct, okay, and that Iran is the head of the octopus and it needs to be taken out.
He's not saying it needs to be taken out. Just to be clear,
it needs to be nullified.
He's saying that the strategy is going to change now because there's an open declaration. Okay, 350 drones and tens of missiles is not a small thing. He's saying, okay, cool. Now, instead of just attacking us through your proxies, you've attacked us through you. And so, finally, we can stop this game we've been playing along for 40 years, where we pretend like, the Houthis are the problem. The Hezbollah are the problem. Hamas, such a headache. No, we don't need to pretend that anymore. We can be honest and open, because you've been honest and open, that you, in fact, are the problem. And so, instead of targeting your friends, we're going to target you. And that's the end of that. And frankly, that's what Trump did. Because taking out Soleimani was exactly that. He understood that the problem wasn't what you're talking about, which is the symptoms. It's not blocking shipping in the Strait of Hormuz.
And once again, taking out Soleimani was probably the dumbest thing that Trump did.
Well, we disagree.
Again, in flagrant violation of international law. And what that did was to substantially yank out the rug from under Trump in terms of up until that point, he had a significant amount of moral high ground in terms of not having actually started a war.
He didn't start a war.
Yeah, he didn't. But what he did do was effectively an act of war against Iran. And again, let's be very clear. How did Iran respond under those circumstances? They told the Americans, we are going to hit your base. And you will shut the fuck up after that. Because if you do respond, then we will hit you even harder. And so they did exactly that. They targeted that base in Iraq. They took them out. I remember the CNN people being on the ground there. And they were American soldiers on the ground. They were literally in tears because they'd never been hit like that before. And Trump did not retaliate at that point. And it's exactly the same situation that you have right now. The Americans are fully aware that this was a calibrated response on the part of Iran. And they know right now that escalation is the worst possible thing. Because if they do escalate, the immediate target is not going to be Israel. It is going to be all of the American bases. And a while back, I mapped out every single one of the bases that was within striking range of Iran. And they are all within 100 to 200 kilometer range.
May I
from
ask?
Iran.
So I don't care. Like those bases exist there for. It turns out when you put weapons in a place, it's to use them. Okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So
No,
so
absolutely,
the
yes.
Americans don't have bases in the Middle East for fun. Okay. They have bases there
The Americans,
for effect.
No, the Americans have bases from the time
Mm-hmm.
when the structure of warfare was very different. Now,
okay.
Now let's take the view around very specifically the case of aircraft carriers. And I used to have these long discussions with my late friend Dion Duplessis, who was also my boss at one point, around the nature of warfare and actually what makes a superpower. And I remember Dion being incredibly impressed at the point at which an Indian frigate that had helicopter gunships on board pitched up in South Africa on a visit. And Dion said the ability to project power is the ability to be able to move airstrike capability to the territory of the enemy. And for the longest time, what has happened in terms of the situation in the Middle East, very specifically, the ability of the Americans to project power from the perspective of airstrikes upon everyone else has been very clear. Now the situation is very different because the ability to actually launch those airstrikes is severely curtailed because of the fact that the ground defense systems are as good as they are. So for the longest time, the Russians were not sending any aircraft over Ukraine until they were absolutely sure that the air defense systems had been taken out. How did they take out the air defense systems? They ensured that they were swarming the place with drones. And when they swarmed the place with drones, that gave them the ability to see exactly where the air defenses were based, which then meant that they could then very precisely target them with hypersonics. Now, if you look at the pattern in terms of what happened with the Iranian strike on Israel over the past couple of days, that's exactly what they did. They first swarmed the place with drones, and then they very specifically targeted three very specific places. It was the two air bases, and it was one site in the Golan Heights, where everything was concentrated. This was not a blitzkrieg that was targeting civilian areas. It was very specifically targeting those. And I'm saying that because the nature of warfare has changed in the way that it has, but all of the technology that has been used up until now by the Western powers has not actually evolved. And the reason why it hasn't evolved is because they are still thinking in terms of the type of weaponry that was so effective in two Iraq wars, that was so effective in Afghanistan, that has been effective going back to the time of Vietnam. And it has not evolved. But the Iranians have actually evolved, the Russians have evolved, the Chinese have evolved, the Indians have evolved. And all of their military capabilities now.
All of the people who haven't fought any wars have evolved, except for the Russians. That's what
Now,
you're saying.
actually, the Indians and the Chinese have been fighting on their borders since the time that I was born. Let's be very clear about that. Okay?
Yeah, but skirmishes I don't take as wars. I'm sorry.
The Americans have never fought a ground war.
The Americans have never fought a ground. What was Vietnam?
Vietnam was not a ground war. Vietnam was carpet bombing.
This conversation is very, very.
Vietnam was carpet bombing with napalm. It's my point about air superiority.
No,
okay?
I'm going to disagree with you, which is to say that I hear you. I think, to me, it's not a change in warfare. It's an addition. There's been additions to warfare. So drones, for example, are an addition to warfare. I take your point about mapping where ground air defenses are, but I'm going to say this, which is that if there was all-out war with Iran tomorrow, okay, yeah, Iran could launch 1,000 drones, 1,500 drones, 2,000 or 20,000 drones. Who gives a fuck? Because the reality is, if there was all-out war, real war, which we don't do anymore, okay, we do human rights war, and this is why we don't win wars anymore. if there was real war, where the intention is to destroy the enemy no matter what, hasn't been done since World War II, okay? If that was the intention, and the Korean War, except not the guys fighting for South Korea, the guys on the other side were fighting in that way. If the intention was to destroy the enemy no matter what, all of those conventional war systems work just fine. Thank you very much. Because, if America sends 1,500 cruise missiles your way at Tehran, there isn't enough ground air defense in the world to stop that assault. Okay, if America decides to drop 20 of those giant bombs that Trump dropped one of those on Afghanistan, I think it was.
Yes, the Moabs.
The Moabs,
the
mother of all bombs.
Yeah, the massive ordnance. Yeah.
That's nice.
Yeah.
You're not getting away from that with your drones. Yeah, your drones are going to you're going to get a drone and it's going to a few hundred of them, and you get them to target. I mean, these are things with propellers, dude.
You see, once again, you're thinking old school, and I'll tell you why you're thinking old school.
Yeah.
How long will it take for American cruise missiles to get from the U.S. to Iran?
Well, it's not from the U.S. It's from the aircraft carriers.
Yes,
that are in the Middle East.
Yes, and how long will it take the Iranians to take out those aircraft carriers?
That's assuming they can take out the aircraft carriers.
They can.
You're saying they can take out the aircraft carriers with what?
I'm saying that they can take out those aircraft carriers.
With what?
With their missiles.
Maybe they can. I mean, I don't know, and I would love to speak to someone who would know if that's how possible that is. I don't think it's that simple to take out any of those battleships, aircraft carriers. They are all so designed to first and foremost protect themselves.
Do we agree that the Iranians have hypersonics?
I don't know. They probably do.
Well,
let me answer that this way.
Well, the reason
if the
why
Iranians don't have them, they can get them from the Russians.
No. But the reason why we do know that the Iranians have them is because 2 days before they launched this attack on Israel, they test fired one of those on their own territory, very publicly. And the speed of the trajectory was well known. Now, my point is that when you have hypersonics, okay, when you're talking about missiles that are traveling at Mach 10, there is no aircraft carrier in the world that can maneuver quickly enough to get out of the path of that hypersonic missile.
That is true.
Then, are they able to shoot down the hypersonic missile? No, the answer is no.
Not yet. The answer is not yet, and I'm going to tell you that the answer will be yes within 5 years. And that will be through laser technology. There's no doubt in my mind that you will be able to. Now, whether you'll be able to take 5 hypersonics aimed at your aircraft carrier, probably not. I don't know. But the idea that we won't build the defense to the attack is disproven by everything in every single war and weapons technology in history. There's always an attack to a defense and a defense to an attack. All that said, I take your point. I'm not arguing that there's been a change in warfare in the sense of these added elements, and I do think that they give an upper hand in some respects, or at least a step up to countries and militaries that before would have been far further down against a superpower like the United States. Whether they actually give them enough of a step up to play on an equal footing, for me, isn't about the weapons, and it isn't about who's doing what in terms of firing at each other. It's very much to do about what the war is about, how that war is waged. And I'm saying this, and I think I said it on the first episode. We don't wage war anymore because we came together after World War II as humanity, and we said, there are rules now. And nowhere in human history have there ever been rules to war. You cannot have rules to war because the entire notion of war is that you want nothing but destruction, complete annihilation of your enemy. And the only thing in history that has been allowed to survive sometimes is the women and the children. And that was not from any kind of humanity. That came completely from, we are going to usurp you and we are going to make your people our people. right?
Which was Schalke's strategy.
Schalke's strategy, the Viking strategy, the guy in Asia, who's everyone's a third a descendant from Genghis Khan. That was the strategy. That was how you did it. And so when we came together and said, no, there are the rules of engagement.
So you're giving us a justification for terrorism right now, Jonathan?
If you consider, if you want to go into the, we got to wrap this up because I actually need to go. But and maybe it's a discussion for another time about terrorism. But then that discussion is the one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter discussion.
No, it's not that.
Well,
what I'm saying is that if you are making the point that there are no rules in terms of war, I am saying that then you must accept that terrorism is as valid a form of war. And I'm saying it isn't.
No, I don't think terrorism is a valid form of war.
Sure.
But again, I wouldn't consider those I wouldn't consider it a war, so to speak.
All right. So let's just park the philosophical point around it for a while. I just want to get back to the question in terms of the specifics of how war has changed. And so I'm going to make a couple of points in terms of, you saying that it's incremental. I'm saying no. I'm saying that there are components that are now obsolete. So to my point, I'm saying aircraft carriers are now obsolete. And I've been saying this for the past 2 years, ever since I saw the first hypersonics in action. So aircraft carriers are now obsolete. Tanks are now obsolete because we've seen the complete ineffectiveness of tanks in terms of the ground wars that has been fought in Ukraine, because the Russians have not needed to make use of their tanks. They've been able to very successfully take out all of the tanks that Ukraine has been able to deploy. Why? Because of the fact that drones are so cheap and plentiful that you can just keep churning them out at an incredibly dizzy rate and take out those tanks. So your ability to fight wars using that old technology again is now obsolete. So we've got aircraft carriers which are obsolete. We've got tanks which are now obsolete. I'm making a prediction in terms of what's going to happen in the next 5 years. You think it's going to be in terms of laser weapons? I don't think it's going to be in terms of laser weapons. The reason why I don't think it's going to be in terms of laser weapons is because the ability to be able to generate a consistent power pulse within a confined space like that of an aircraft carrier for defense purposes, to be able to produce a laser that is strong enough to be able to take out an incoming missile is incredibly constrained. Just the sheer amount of power that you would need to generate to feed that laser within the context of an aircraft carrier, I don't believe is possible. The technological leap that I'm predicting that we are going to be seeing in the next 5 years is going to be war fought with robotics.
Okay.
And you are going to see droids on the ground that are going to be fighting these wars. And at that point, what we have to hope is that the technology that Israel has purportedly been working on for the past while, which is EMP technology, you've got to hope that that's real. Because the only thing that's going to be able to take out droids, which are effectively electronic warfare, is going to be very focused EMPs. Because right now, anyone can deploy an EMP, but the problem is that indiscriminate use of an EMP means that you take out your own electronics as well as the incoming electronics.
Sure.
So, yeah.
All right, that is a very interesting conversation. We're going to call it there. We've gone from media faux pas to NGO involvement in politics to war, our all-out war between myself and Kanthan. I take your point on aircraft carriers. I also think to some extent they are slightly obsolete. But we can obviously continue that another time, and a very interesting meandering conversation indeed.
Are you sending money to Daily Maverick?
Am I sending money to Daily Maverick? No. There used to be an expression that even if someone was on fire, I wouldn't piss on them. I'm not obviously saying that, but I certainly am not giving them any of my money. They will not see a cent of it. However, I have said that through the Overton Press, which I am trying to build, If there are any real journalists out there, because Paulie van Wyk was complaining that without the Daily Maverick, she would be unable to do her investigative journalism. So I'm offering funding. If it's large amounts of funding, I will help you crowdfund it, and you can publish it on your own website. If it's smaller amounts, I will fund you and publish it on the Overton Press. Feel free. You want to do journalism? Come do journalism. No problem. The issue is not, in fact, that people want to do journalism. The issue is, in fact, that nobody wants to buy the shit you're peddling.
And the flip side is that you have business models. You remember Barry Weiss?
Yeah.
Yeah, who's now running a very successful.
FB.
Yes.
Yeah, the FB.com. Great publication.
And it's making money, and it's churning out journalism, and it's not dependent on getting funding from. It's the AfriForum model. You have credibility with the people; they will actually pay for it.
Yeah, give people what they want, and turns out that they'll buy it, which is the point I brought up at the very beginning. Nobody who provides a product which is actually liked and needed needs to convince anyone that they need to buy it. They just do. And I think we can end it off there.
Sounds
you
good.
can subscribe at overtonpress.substack.com. More stuff coming there soon. I know it's been a little bit quiet of late. As always, please like the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to it on or watching it on. If you're watching on YouTube, I do apologize for these HD cameras. They make us look terrible. And as Kanthan pointed out before we started recording, perhaps we just do look terrible. And please do tell people about the podcast if you've enjoyed it and if you find it valuable. Thanks so much for listening or watching, and we'll catch you next time. Cheers.